Christmas Eve. Snow falls outside a desolate warehouse where Ethan Ross, a single father, is unjustly fired. His daughter's joyful photo the only warmth against the cold termination notice. His plans for her meager Christmas gifts crumble. Later, a knock echoes at his apartment door. The company's imperious CEO, Clara Grayson, stands there, an unexpected, expensive silhouette in the falling snow, clutching a folder and a heavy bag. Neither knows this collision will rewrite their futures. Sparked by a child's innocent letter, Ethan Ross had learned to measure his worth by the steady rhythm of packaging work that kept his hands busy and provided just enough income to support 7-year-old Lily in their modest apartment, where every dollar was carefully allocated between rent, food, and the small luxuries that made childhood feel magical despite their limited circumstances. At 35 years old, he had accepted that his life would be defined by reliability rather than ambition, by showing up for every shift at Grayson Foods and doing his work with quiet confidence that managers barely noticed. But that kept the production line moving efficiently. The Christmas Eve shift should have been just another evening of packaging food products destined for holiday tables throughout the city. Ethan's practiced hands moved through familiar motions while his mind wandered to the small celebration he'd planned for Lily. The modest gifts he'd managed to afford through careful saving and the borrowed Christmas tree that would make their apartment feel festive, despite lacking the abundance that other families took for granted. He had stayed late to finish wrapping the final gift boxes, volunteering for extra hours that would mean a few additional dollars on his next paycheck. His manager approached with an expression that immediately signaled something was wrong. It was the kind of careful neutrality that people adopted when delivering bad news they didn't want to take responsibility for communicating. The paper landed on Ethan's workstation with a finality that made his stomach drop before he'd even read the words printed in cold corporate language about downsizing and budget cuts and the termination of his employment effective immediately. "You're letting me go on Christmas Eve?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying disbelief rather than anger. Because surely there had been some mistake. Surely the company wouldn't eliminate positions on a holiday when people depended on their paychecks for celebrating with their families. "Company policy," the manager replied with a tone that suggested he was following orders rather than making decisions. That arguing would be pointless because the choice had been made by people far above his level who didn't concern themselves with the human impact of their strategic decisions. "Budget cuts require immediate implementation. You'll receive your final check by mail within 2 weeks. Ethan tried one more appeal, his pride dissolving under desperation about how he would explain to Lily that Christmas would be different than he'd promised. "Please let me finish out the week," he said quietly. "My daughter's expecting money for gifts. Just a few more days so I can give her something for Christmas morning." "No exceptions," the manager said flatly, already turning away to avoid further conversation that might force him to acknowledge the cruelty of timing that eliminated someone's income during the season supposedly dedicated to goodwill and generosity. "Clear out your station and leave by end of shift." Ethan gathered his few personal items into a small box, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders as he realized how thoroughly this single decision would disrupt everything he'd been carefully balancing. The photo of Lily that he'd kept by his workstation smiled up at him from where it now sat atop his meager belongings. Her handwritten note was attached with tape that was starting to yellow with age, declaring, "I believe Dad is the best person in the world."
The walk home through falling snow felt longer than usual. Each step was weighted by questions about how he would pay next month's rent, or buy groceries, or maintain the stability that Lily needed from her only remaining parent. He held the small box against his chest, protecting his few possessions from the snow, while his mind raced through impossible calculations about stretching savings that didn't exist far enough to cover basic needs until he could find new employment. Across the city, in a ballroom decorated with expensive elegance, Clara Grayson attended the Christmas Eve gala her company traditionally hosted for major clients and business partners. It was the kind of obligatory networking event that required her presence, but that felt increasingly hollow as she moved through conversations about market share and quarterly projections.
while champagne flowed and everyone pretended their primary concern wasn't just how much money they could extract from the holiday season. A casual comment from one of the servers about how terrible it must be to get fired on Christmas Eve made Clara pause mid-conversation. Her attention suddenly focused on what the server was saying rather than on the business associate trying to discuss potential partnerships. "Someone was terminated tonight," she asked, interrupting the ongoing discussion without apology. "On Christmas Eve." The server looked uncomfortable about having spoken within hearing range of the CEO, clearly worried about overstepping boundaries between staff and executives. "I heard the warehouse manager talking about layoffs that had to be processed today because of budget deadlines," she explained carefully. "Said something about getting them done before the holiday break so the paperwork would be finalized." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. Recognition that her company had apparently eliminated positions on Christmas Eve, despite her explicit instructions that any necessary staff reduction should be handled with sensitivity to timing and family circumstances. The realization that someone under her authority had made a father spend Christmas explaining to his child why they'd lost their income made her feel complicit in cruelty she'd never knowingly approved. "Excuse me," Clara said abruptly to the business associate she'd been speaking with, already moving toward the exit without bothering to make polite excuses about why she was abandoning her own company's gala in the middle of the event. She pulled out her phone while walking to her car, calling her assistant despite the late hour, and demanding information about who had been terminated that day and where they lived. The information came through while Clara was driving through snowy streets, her expensive car feeling obscene as she passed neighborhoods where people clearly struggled with circumstances so different from her own privileged existence. Ethan Ross, warehouse worker, single father to a 7-year-old daughter, had been terminated that evening as part of a budget reduction initiative that Clara had approved in principle, but had never imagined would be implemented with such callous timing. She found his address through company records. It was a modest apartment building in a neighborhood Clara had never visited, despite it being only miles from her luxury penthouse. The physical distance between their lives was nothing compared to the gulf of different circumstances and opportunities. She sat in her car for several minutes trying to formulate what she would say, how she could possibly apologize for institutional cruelty she hadn't directly committed. But that had happened under her authority and with her company's resources. Ethan's apartment felt smaller than usual when viewed through the lens of unemployment and an uncertain future. The modest space that had seemed adequate when he had a steady income suddenly appeared inadequate for raising a child who deserved better than her father's limited ability to provide. He turned on the small space heater, trying to warm the room before Lily woke from her nap, maintaining the illusion that everything was fine despite the termination notice crumpled in his pocket. "Dad?" Lily's sleepy voice called from the bedroom. "Is it time for Santa yet?" Ethan forced a brightness into his voice that he didn't feel, moving to where his daughter was rubbing her eyes and looking around with a 7-year-old's mixture of excitement and confusion about why she'd been napping in the early evening. "Not quite yet, sweetheart," he assured her. "But soon. Why don't you come help me with the Christmas tree?" The tree was barely more than a large branch propped in a bucket and decorated with paper ornaments Lily had made at school. This modest display represented everything Ethan could afford, but somehow contained more love than the elaborate decorations visible in wealthier neighbors' windows. Lily didn't seem to notice or care about its simplicity, carefully arranging her handmade decorations with a serious concentration that suggested she viewed this as important artistic work. "Dad, did Santa send you enough money for present?" Lily asked, with the kind of directness that children employed before learning to avoid topics that might make adults uncomfortable. "Because I told him I don't need much. Just maybe one thing and for you to be happy." The question made Ethan's throat tight with emotions he couldn't afford to display. Because maintaining Lily's sense of security required him to pretend everything was fine despite circumstances that were definitely not fine. "Don't worry about presents," he managed. "Santa always takes care of good kids like you." When Lily finally fell asleep after their modest dinner and tree decorating, Ethan sat alone, staring at the empty space where he'd planned to put gifts he could no longer afford. The reality of his situation settled over him like a weight he couldn't quite lift. He picked up the card Lily had made him for Father's Day months ago. The crayon drawing of them holding hands accompanied by her careful printing, "I believe Dad is the best person in the world." The knock on the door startled him from his contemplation. Unexpected at this late hour on Christmas Eve, when most people were celebrating with their families rather than visiting strangers. He opened the door expecting perhaps a neighbor or maybe someone who'd gotten the wrong apartment. He was definitely not expecting to find Clara Grayson standing in the hallway wearing an expensive coat and holding a large bag along with a folder of papers. "You're Ethan Ross?" Clara asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and was really just trying to figure out how to begin a conversation she clearly hadn't fully planned, despite having driven here with apparent purpose. "Yes," Ethan replied cautiously, recognizing her face from company communications, but unable to immediately process why the CEO of Grayson Foods would be standing at his apartment door on Christmas Eve. "Can I help you? I'm Clara Grayson," she said, as though her identity wasn't already obvious from her appearance in every corporate communication and media coverage of the company. "I came to say that you didn't deserve to be treated the way you were today. The termination timing was unconscionable, and I take full responsibility for not having policies in place that would prevent such callous implementation of necessary budget cuts." Ethan stood frozen, trying to process why his former employer's CEO would drive to his apartment to apologize personally rather than just sending some corporate communication through human resources channels. Clara seemed to interpret his silence as permission to continue speaking, her words tumbling out with an urgency that suggested she'd been rehearsing this explanation during her drive. "Your daughter sent a letter to corporate headquarters last month," Clara said, pulling a piece of paper from her folder with obvious care for its condition. "It ended up on my desk yesterday, and reading it made me realize how thoroughly I'd lost sight of the actual humans whose labor makes my company successful. She wrote about how you work night shifts so she can have normal days, how you make sure Grayson Foods delivers good meals to families, even though it means you're away from her during evenings and holidays." Clara held out the letter so Ethan could see Lily's careful printing. The words were clearly labored over with a 7-year-old's uncertain spelling but unmistakable sincerity. "My dad works all night bringing good food to everyone's houses. I just wish someone would bring happiness back to him, too." Ethan felt tears threatening as he read his daughter's words. A recognition that Lily had been more aware of his sacrifices and struggles than he'd realized, despite his careful efforts to shield her from understanding how difficult their circumstances actually were. "She wasn't supposed to send that," he said roughly. "I didn't know she'd written to the company." "I'm glad she did," Clara replied, "because it made me ask questions about how we treat the people who actually do the work that makes everything else possible. About whether my strategic decisions about budgets and efficiency were creating institutional cruelty I'd never consciously approve if I understood the human impact." She held out the bag she'd been carrying, its weight suggesting substantial contents rather than just a token gesture. "I brought some things for Christmas," Clara said. "Gifts for your daughter and groceries for the week and an envelope that contains a severance payment, much more generous than company policy requires, because inadequate policy was part of the problem that needs correction." Ethan wanted to refuse, his pride making acceptance of what felt like charity difficult despite his desperate need for exactly the kind of help Clara was offering. But looking at the letter in his hand, at his daughter's words about wishing someone would bring happiness to him, he recognized that refusing help meant putting his pride ahead of Lily's needs in ways that wouldn't honor the sentiment his daughter had expressed. "Thank you," he said simply, accepting the bag and stepping aside to let Clara enter his modest apartment. "I don't know what to say beyond that. This is more than I expected or felt I deserved, given I was just doing my job." "You were doing much more than just your job," Clara corrected gently, her eyes taking in the modest Christmas decorations and the obvious care that had gone into creating a holiday atmosphere despite limited resources. "You were being an excellent father while working a job that didn't pay enough or appreciate you adequately. That deserves recognition rather than Christmas Eve termination." Clara's presence in his modest apartment should have felt awkward or uncomfortable given the vast differences in their circumstances and the power dynamics inherent in their relationship as former employer and terminated employee. But something about the late hour and the unusual circumstances in Clara's obvious, genuine remorse created a space where normal social hierarchies seemed less relevant than the simple human connection of two people trying to navigate an uncomfortable situation with decency and honesty. "I'm sorry the apartment is a mess," Ethan said, suddenly self-conscious about the worn furniture and the makeshift Christmas decorations that looked even more inadequate, viewed through the eyes of someone who presumably celebrated holidays with expensive elegance rather than paper ornaments and borrowed trees. "It's not messy," Clara replied, her tone carrying sincerity rather than just a polite dismissal of his concern. "It's lived in and loved in, which is something my expensive penthouse lacks despite all its designer furniture and professional decorating. This space has warmth that money apparently can't buy." She moved toward the modest Christmas tree, studying Lily's handmade ornaments with obvious interest rather than the polite tolerance wealthy people often displayed toward children's art that didn't meet professional aesthetic standards. "Your daughter made these?" Clara asked, gently touching a paper snowflake that had been carefully cut and decorated with glitter that was already shedding onto the floor. "She spent weeks on them," Ethan confirmed, pride evident in his voice, despite knowing the decorations were objectively simple compared to what wealthier families could purchase. "Every evening after I got home from work, she'd show me her progress and ask if I thought Santa would approve of her artistic choices." The image of father and daughter spending evenings together, creating Christmas decorations from whatever materials they could afford, made Clara's chest tight with recognition of what she'd been missing in her own life, the genuine human connection that existed independently of wealth or status or professional achievement. Her own Christmases had become increasingly elaborate and expensive, while simultaneously feeling emptier performances of seasonal obligation rather than genuine celebrations of anything meaningful. "Can I help with anything?" Clara asked, the offer emerging before she'd fully considered what she was volunteering for, or whether it was appropriate for a CEO to suddenly insert herself into a former employee's Christmas Eve preparations. "I noticed you mentioned making cookies earlier, and I have to admit, I haven't actually baked anything in years, despite owning a kitchen that cost more than most people's annual salary." Ethan looked surprised by the offer, but gestured toward his tiny kitchen, where he'd been planning to make simple sugar cookies from a mix that was all he could afford. "I was going to make some for Lily to decorate tomorrow," he said. "She loves putting frosting and sprinkles on things, claims it's her favorite part of Christmas even more than presents." They worked together in the cramped kitchen space, their proximity occasionally resulting in accidental contact that would have been professionally inappropriate in any other context. But that somehow felt natural given the unusual circumstances. Clara followed Ethan's instructions with surprising humility for someone used to commanding boardrooms, her expensive clothes getting dusted with flour and her carefully maintained professional image giving way to something more authentic as she laughed at her own inability to shape the dough properly. "I'm terrible at this," Clara admitted after her third attempt at cutting out a star shape resulted in something that looked more like an abstract blob than a recognizable form. "How do you make it look so easy?" "Practice," Ethan replied with a slight smile, "and lower standards for what constitutes an acceptable cookie shape. Lily isn't judging based on professional baking criteria. She just wants something she can decorate with obscene amounts of frosting tomorrow." Their conversation evolved naturally while they worked, moving from awkward employer-employee dynamics into something that resembled actual friendship as they shared stories about their very different lives. Clara talked about the loneliness that came with her position, the way professional success had created isolation despite being surrounded by people who wanted her attention for strategic purposes. Ethan described the challenges of single parenthood combined with insufficient income, the constant balance between being present for his daughter and working enough to support them adequately.
Her mother left when Lily was 3, Ethan explained during a lull in their baking activity. Just disappeared one day without explanation or goodbye, leaving me to figure out how to be both parents while maintaining employment that barely covered our basic needs. I've spent the last 4 years feeling like I'm constantly failing at both roles. never quite managing to be a good enough father or a reliable enough employee. "You're not failing," Clara said with a conviction that came from observing how obviously loved and well-adjusted Lily appeared, despite their modest circumstances. "Your daughter wrote a letter to a corporation praising your character and work ethic, decorated this entire apartment with handmade love, and clearly feels secure enough to sleep peacefully despite whatever challenges you're facing. That's the opposite of failure." The validation made Ethan's eyes bright with unshed tears, a recognition that he needed to hear exactly what Clara was saying, even if he'd been too proud to acknowledge how much he questioned his own adequacy as a parent and provider. When Lily emerged sleepily from her bedroom, apparently woken by the sounds of conversation and activity in the kitchen, her face lit up with delight at discovering they had a visitor. "Who are you?" Lily asked Clara with a 7-year-old's directness, clearly not intimidated by the expensive clothing or sophisticated appearance that marked Clara as obviously from a different socio-economic world. "I'm Clara," she replied, kneeling down to be at Lily's eye level, rather than towering over her in ways that might feel intimidating. "I work at the company where your dad works, and I came to say thank you for the beautiful letter you wrote about him. It reminded me about what really matters in business and life." Lily's expression showed recognition dawning, her eyes widening as she processed what Clara was saying. "You're the boss lady," she exclaimed. "Did you bring Dad his job back because he didn't want to tell me? But I know something bad happened today, and I think maybe he's worried about Christmas." The child's perceptiveness made both adults pause, a recognition that Lily had been more aware of the day's events than Ethan had hoped, despite his careful attempts to maintain normalcy. Clara looked at Ethan as though asking permission before responding, not wanting to overstep or make promises about employment without understanding what he wanted from this situation. "I'm going to make sure your dad has something even better than his old job," Clara said carefully. "Because he's talented and hardworking and deserves opportunities that actually appreciate those qualities rather than just treating him like interchangeable labor. But that's something we can talk about after Christmas when we're not supposed to be focusing on cookies and celebration." Lily seemed satisfied with this answer, her attention shifting to the cookies cooling on the counter with obvious excitement about the decorating opportunities they represented. "Can I help?" she asked hopefully. "I'm really good at putting sprinkles on things, and Dad says I have artistic vision, even though I'm only 7. "I would love your help," Clara assured her, genuinely meaning it rather than just humoring a child. "I'm terrible at decorating and could use guidance from someone with actual expertise in artistic sprinkle application." The three of them spent the next hour decorating cookies together, Lily directing operations with a confident authority that made the adults laugh while they followed her increasingly elaborate instructions about proper frosting to sprinkle ratios and the importance of making each cookie have its own personality. When Lily finally returned to bed after sampling several of her creations, she paused at the doorway to deliver a pronouncement that seemed far wiser than her 7 years should have allowed. "I think Santa sent you," Lily told Clara. "Seriously, because I asked him to bring Dad someone who would appreciate him. And here you are on Christmas Eve. That's too perfect to be an accident." Clara left early the next morning before Lily woke, wanting to give the family privacy for their Christmas celebration, but leaving behind a card with a handwritten message that Ethan discovered when he went to make coffee. The note was brief, but carried a weight that suggested considerable thought had gone into its composition. "Open your own food business. I'll be your first investor and partner in making sure good food reaches people who need it most." Attached to the note was a business card for Clara's personal attorney, along with another card that read, "Grayson Community Project co-founder Ethan Ross," with an official company logo, suggesting this wasn't just a spontaneous idea, but something Clara had arranged to be formalized even before arriving at his apartment the previous night. Ethan stood in his tiny kitchen holding the cards and trying to process what Clara was offering. It was the opportunity to create something meaningful, rather than just working for wages that barely covered basic needs. The chance to actually use his knowledge about food distribution and community needs in ways that would genuinely help people rather than just maximizing corporate profits. The trust implied in making him co-founder of a corporate initiative felt enormous, especially given they'd known each other less than 24 hours, and their relationship had begun with his termination from her company. Christmas Day proceeded with the simple celebration Ethan had planned, Lily delighting in the modest gifts he'd managed to arrange despite his financial constraints, and in the elaborate cookie decorating session they'd completed the night before with Clara's help. But Ethan found his mind returning repeatedly to the business cards and the possibilities they represented. The vision of creating something that would both support his family and serve the community in ways that aligned with his values, rather than just whoever paid his wages. He called Clara that evening after Lily was asleep using the personal number she'd written on the card, despite feeling uncertain about whether contacting his former CEO on Christmas night was appropriate. She answered on the second ring, her voice suggesting she'd been hoping he would call rather than being annoyed by the intrusion on her holiday. "I wanted to thank you again," Ethan said, suddenly uncertain how to articulate everything he was feeling about her generosity and the opportunities she was creating. "For everything you did last night and for the business proposal. It's more than I ever imagined possible. Honestly, more than I feel qualified to attempt, given I'm just a warehouse worker without any formal business training." "You're not just anything," Clara corrected firmly. "You're someone who understands food distribution logistics from having actually done the work. Who knows what communities need because you're part of those communities rather than studying them from a corporate distance. Who has integrity evident in how your daughter writes about you and how you maintain excellence in work that didn't adequately compensate or appreciate your contributions. Those qualifications matter more than business school degrees when it comes to creating something that actually serves people rather than just extracting profit from them." The conversation evolved into a detailed discussion about what their collaborative project might look like. Clara's business expertise combined with Ethan's practical knowledge to sketch out a vision for a community food initiative that would provide affordable nutrition to people who couldn't access or afford the elaborate options marketed to wealthier consumers. They talked for nearly 2 hours, their different perspectives complementing each other in ways that suggested genuine partnership rather than just a wealthy benefactor helping a struggling worker. Over the following months, what began as an abstract concept transformed into an actual business called Lily's Table, named for Ethan's daughter and her innocent wish that someone would bring happiness to people who worked hard to feed others. The storefront opened in Ethan's neighborhood, offering fresh, affordable food to people who typically had to choose between nutrition and paying rent, creating jobs for others who'd been dismissed from corporate positions as easily as Ethan had been terminated on Christmas Eve. Clara became a regular presence at the store despite her other corporate obligations, often arriving in casual clothes rather than her usual executive attire to help stock shelves or work the register alongside Ethan and the small staff they'd hired. She discovered that this work felt more meaningful than any corporate achievement, that the direct impact of helping individual families access good food created a satisfaction that quarterly earnings reports had never provided. "Why do you keep coming here?" Ethan asked one evening after they closed the store and were reviewing the day's receipts. "You could be anywhere doing anything with your resources and position, but instead you're spending evenings working retail in a neighborhood probably far from wherever you live." Clara looked up from the papers she'd been reviewing, her expression showing a vulnerability that her corporate persona rarely displayed. "Because being here makes me feel like I'm actually doing something worthwhile," she said honestly. "Because working alongside you and seeing the direct impact we're having on real families reminds me why I wanted to run a food company in the first place. Before strategic planning and profit maximization became more important than the actual humans we were supposedly serving." She paused, clearly considering whether to voice what she was really feeling beyond just professional satisfaction with their project success. "And because I've come to care about you and Lily more than is probably professionally appropriate for business partners." You've shown me what life looks like when it's built on genuine values rather than just the accumulation of wealth and status. And I don't want to go back to the isolation I was living in before your daughter's letter reminded me what actually matters." Ethan felt his heart skip at Clara's admission, a recognition that what had begun as an unlikely connection on Christmas Eve had somehow evolved into something that felt like it might become permanent rather than just a temporary collaboration. "I care about you too," he said quietly, "though I keep wondering if that's appropriate given the power dynamics and the fact that you're still technically my employer, even if the business structure is more partnership than traditional employment." "Maybe appropriate matters less than genuine," Clara suggested, moving closer to where Ethan stood behind the counter. "Maybe what we're building here, the business, the relationship, the family that seems to be forming around us matters more than following conventional rules about what CEOs and former warehouse workers are supposed to be to each other." 1 year after that Christmas Eve termination that had seemed like a disaster, but had somehow become the beginning of everything that mattered. Lily's table had expanded to serve hundreds of families while employing dozens of workers who'd been dismissed from corporate positions that hadn't valued their actual contributions. The store had become a community hub where people gathered not just for affordable food, but for connection and support that transformed a simple commercial transaction into genuine human interaction. Christmas Eve found the store decorated festively and filled with people receiving free holiday meals. The celebration was open to anyone who needed food or company, or just wanted to participate in the kind of community gathering that had become Lily's table's signature. On a small stage in the corner, Lily stood with other children from the neighborhood preparing to sing carols. Her confidence and joy were evident in ways that made clear how thoroughly she'd thrived over the past year. Clara and Ethan worked side by side distributing food and gifts, their partnership having evolved from an awkward beginning into a genuine relationship that everyone around them recognized, even if they'd never formally defined it beyond a business collaboration. When Lily's performance began, they paused their work to watch. Both of them were moved by the sight of this confident 7-year-old leading her peers through a rendition of Silent Night that transformed the modest store into a space filled with magic that expensive corporate celebrations could never manufacture. As the final notes of the carol faded, Lily jumped down from the stage and ran to where Clara and Ethan stood together, grabbing both their hands with a 7-year-old's certainty that they belonged together as a unit rather than just separate adults who happened to be in the same space. "Now, I believe in Santa Claus for real," Lily announced loudly enough that nearby people smiled at her enthusiasm. "Because he sent Miss Clara to Dad on Christmas Eve, and that's the best present anyone could ask for." The three of them stood together, surrounded by the community they'd built. The evidence of their successful partnership was visible in every person receiving food and every worker who'd found employment after being dismissed from less understanding employers. Outside the windows, snow fell just as it had 1 year ago when Clara had driven through the city to apologize to a fired worker she'd never met. Neither of them could have imagined how thoroughly that impulsive decision would transform both their lives. "Thank you for knocking on my door," Ethan said quietly. His words meant primarily for Clara, though Lily could obviously hear. For seeing past corporate efficiency to recognize actual humans. For teaching me that dreams don't require the sacrifice of values. For becoming family when neither of us was looking for such complications. Clara squeezed his hand, her smile bright with a joy that had nothing to do with corporate success and everything to do with genuine connection. "Thank you for letting me in," she replied. "For showing me what life looks like when it's built on love rather than just achievement. For proving that the best gifts arrive unexpectedly and transform everything." Lily looked up at both of them with an expression that combined childish satisfaction with wisdom beyond her years. "The real Christmas miracle is when we bring happiness to other people," she declared. "That's what makes the magic real."